Welcome all to today's session of literacy strategies to enhance student success, something that we're all very interested in or we wouldn't be here. Today we have with us Dr. Jana Kirchner, and we're delighted to have Jana. She has been with us in a previous session and did a fabulous job. We had lots of great comments and questions. So Jana, let me just turn this over to you. And again, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Pam. Hi, everyone. My name is Jana, as Pam said, and I'm excited to be with you and glad you're with us in a very busy time of your school year. Let me tell you a little bit about me, because when I'm on your end of it, I want to know who's the person talking to me. I have just recently retired from 27 years in a variety of different education jobs in Kentucky. So I was a high school social studies and English teacher, worked with teaching American history grants for several years, was a social studies literacy coach with elementary, middle, and high school, and just recently retired as an instructional supervisor at a school district. So I'm excited to be able to do some part-time work with a social studies school service, and really excited about talking to you today about what is one of my passions, and that is how do we integrate literacy strategies in the social studies content that we know and love, and how do we create readers and writers and thinkers in our content area. So this is going to be a lot of me sharing some strategies with you, but there are about 2 or 3 times in the presentation when I would love to get some input from you and your ideas. So if you will type in the chat feature as those opportunities come up, I would appreciate it. And I will probably talk through some of it, but please jump in and add comments or questions at any time. Let me show you a little bit about what our session will be like today. The webinar will focus on 3 big topics, and I want us to start with, what does it mean to think like a historian? And we all know that social studies is a very broad discipline, so I may say historian sometimes, but also those same skills would apply to a geographer, an economist, a political scientist. We know there are lots of domains under social studies. So we'll talk about what does that thinking look like as an introduction to literacy skills. What is inquiry? We all know that is very much a focus in the social studies world right now. How do we integrate text, and what do we mean just by that concept of text to teach social studies? And then we'll talk about some literacy strategies that work to be intentional about integrating those skills into what we teach. And we'll talk about some that work before reading and during reading and after reading. And then also want to show you ways to use active classroom resources to be intentional about integrating those literacy skills. So that's our plan for this afternoon. I want to ground us first before we start, however, in the document that is the guiding force right now in social studies in the nation. And most states are grappling with how do we either revise our state social studies standards or create new social studies standards to implement inquiry, and what is the focus of the college, career, and civic life, or C3 framework. So the backbone, I guess, to the C3 framework is what's called the inquiry arc. And it gives us a picture of what inquiry looks like, sounds like in our social studies discipline. So I want us to kind of walk through this to ground what we're going to do for the rest of the webinar. So there are 4 dimensions. The first dimension is developing questions and planning inquiries. Now, those could be teacher generated, or even better, those could be student-generated inquiries that guide our learning, and I'm going to show you some strategies for how to do that. The second dimension is how do we apply those disciplinary tools? Sometimes they're called literacy tools, or reading, thinking like a historian or geographer. How do we apply those in our content? The third dimension is how do we evaluate sources for things like credibility, for bias, for point of view. How do we sort through that with some context and help students to be able to do that? And how do we have them develop claims and use evidence to support what they say? And then the fourth dimension is how do we get students to become active, informed citizens at the end of this K-12 experience that we provide for them, where they can read a newspaper, read a tweet, or a social media post, and understand the main ideas and the author's point of view, and then go out to be responsible, informed citizens, knowing their rights and responsibilities. That one's a little tougher to do in a webinar, so we're going to focus most of our work today in those second and third dimensions and talk about what does it mean to use literacy skills to be able to do those dimensions 2 and 3. So to get us started, I want us to first think, if I say, what does it mean to read and think like a historian? Now you can use geographer, economist. I want you to respond in the chat box. What skills does that mean? What skills would be needed to think like a historian? And I'll give you just a few minutes and then brainstorm to get us started. Okay, so we got basic literacy skills in the language of instruction. So those literacy skills could be reading and figuring out a main idea, reading and simply understanding the text you read, figuring out an author's point of view, comparing and contrasting events, understanding cause and effect. That's prevalent in the field of history. Being able to decide which source is more credible than another. Absolutely. Understand the context point of view, understand the bias. I'm going to say a few times in this webinar, this is Kirshner opinion based on my background. So obviously we all have a set of skills and a context of our experiences that help us articulate our beliefs. How do you teach students to do that? Thank you for your responses. One more question I want you to think about. If I ask you to think of the concept of text as any kinds of sources that we use to teach social studies, give me some examples of those texts. And I put some pictures on there to prompt your thinking. So what do I mean by text in social studies? We have primary sources. We have government documents, absolutely. We have images. We have maps and charts. We have political cartoons. We have journals. We have letters. We have a variety of secondary sources. Usually in these kind of questions, everybody's afraid to say the textbook, but the textbook or articles, graphs and charts, pamphlets, posters, broadsides are such a fun thing to use at different historical periods. Videos, a variety of primary and secondary source, depending on the time period, of videos and images. Artwork. Thank you for your great ideas. I love that these little comments are popping in. So I'm going to challenge you as we kind of pursue this webinar to think of how are you integrating a variety of types of sources or text in how you teach your social studies. If I were to zap into your classroom, what might I see as far as students tackling text? And one way to think about that, and I like informational text such as music and architecture, absolutely. I showed a picture there of Islam and prayer in Islam, and absolutely pictures and buildings are great examples of text. So one of the challenge for us is to think about sometimes text as evidence or clues. So sometimes social studies, we know, gets a bad rep because it tends to be a lot of facts. But we know in the real world of thinking like a historian or a geographer or an economist, there are a lot of questions. There's a research question and you have to go find text, whether that be a map, a newspaper, a picture, a chart or graph, to help you figure out an answer to those questions. Sometimes the sources may disagree. Sometimes the clues may not line up. You have to figure that out. And those are the skills we want students to be able to develop. So as we all grow and reflect on our practice, think of this question and let it guide your thinking as we do the next few slides. How do you design lessons and units where students analyze text to build understanding? So let me say that a little bit differently. How do you intentionally plan experiences in your units, maybe not every lesson, in your units, where students are analyzing a variety of text? So let me share my personal journey with that. I knew as I became a high school social studies teacher that one of the things that fascinated me about history was hearing it from someone's point of view, someone who actually lived at that time period. And that was much more fascinating to me than textbooks. So I knew when I wanted to design lessons that I wanted to incorporate primary sources. So my high school classroom, as we talked about the road to revolution, I wanted to integrate Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech. Well, my lesson plan and my learning target was posted on the board, and it was something like this. Students will analyze the main points of Patrick Henry's speech. So I wanted them to be able to pick out the main ideas. But then I also knew that that speech was really powerful in igniting a lot of opinion towards the revolution. So I wanted them to be able to also pick out what about his speech was persuasive. Well, I introduced that objective and learning target in my lesson plan to my principal. That was my objective and learning target. So here's what I did. I copied it. I put students in groups. I think I even gave out highlighters because I wanted them to really tackle that text and get some meaning from it. And then we started. Now here's the reality, and I hope that some of you might bond with this personal story. In about 10 minutes, if that long, here's what I look like. And I tell you that, and those of you that have tried this will know what happened. They got stuck in their groups. They didn't understand the vocabulary words. Some of the spelling was different than what they were used to. They would read 3 or 4 sentences and had no idea what Patrick Henry was trying to say. So you can picture this classroom scenario, lots of hands up, a totally frazzled teacher running around from group to group, trying to figure out how to help them, thinking even as I was doing that, I probably should have done this differently. So as I stopped at each table, I would help them by reading out loud the paragraph and pointing out to them what I thought were the main ideas of the speech. Once I did that, they could underline, they could write it down in the margins. They understood the speech. As I look back now, many years later, I think, who was doing the analyzing? Who was figuring out techniques? It was all my thinking that came out on those papers. So needless to say, that did not work well for me, although it looked good on paper. The plan did not work well. So we're going to talk about some strategies to do that better, honestly, than I did as a young teacher when I was trying to figure out how to do it. And I wanted to put the literacy standards up here just to be intentional about showing them to you. And I know it's a little bit hard to read on this, but all those skills that you just said and all those texts that you just brainstormed are right out of the literacy standards. Just determining main ideas, figuring out bias, perspective, tackling difficult vocabulary words, analyzing multiple points of view on a source. All those things are the literacy skills, but we just framed it through the lens of what do we do as good social studies teachers. So one more question. I want you to kind of type your thinking on this one in the chat box as well. And that is this. What are some challenges that you have, or all of us have, with having students tackle text in your classroom? And I thought tackle was a good verb to use there. What are some of the challenges with having students tackle text in your classroom? You could give me some feedback in the chat box. Many times you're absolutely right, Vanessa, the text is above students' reading level. Quite honestly, even as adults with majors in this, sometimes we would have to admit that we have trouble tackling primary sources. Not enough background, thanks Melissa, or context to understand what's happening either in the written text or in visual political cartoons, I think are very difficult for students because they don't have the context or prior knowledge. Figuring out how to differentiate those primary sources when some students can tackle the tough ones and figure them out and others struggle with basic reading. Absolutely. Students low reading level. Thank you, Marjorie. Seeing some common patterns in that. And here's my advice. It is not easy to implement, but it is the only way students will get better. And that is to develop better readers, provide multiple opportunities in every unit for students to interact with a variety of text. So let's look at that and think about what that means. The only way they're going to get better is if we provide them multiple opportunities. And I usually say not in every lesson, but in every unit, somewhere in your units, where students can interact and tackle a variety of text. That could be a primary source, that could be a political cartoon, a map, or graph. We all know from living this content that those are all different types of skills. So how are we providing opportunities for them to engage with those texts? And not as my non-example, my Patrick Henry speech, where I tried to do it, but I ended up doing all the work. And how do we let them do it? I like your comment. Good practice makes permanent. We'll talk about that some more. Thank you for your comments on the chat feature. Keep them coming, and feel free to ask questions that way as well. Pam's also going to help monitor that for me while I'm talking. So let's talk about what are some strategies that work. We're going to break those into before reading and during reading and after reading. And I'm going to just quickly go over a variety of strategies, and I will tell you now that these are probably not new to you, but I think the key for us as social studies folks is to be very intentional about using them and figuring out how we can adapt them to our content area. So let's talk about some ways to integrate pre-reading strategies before kids see the text or before kids interact with the text. One of my favorite is a gallery walk, and I lump these under building background knowledge because several of you said in your chat comments that they just don't have the context. They don't have the background knowledge to be able to understand and connect those ideas to their schema. And I heard schema explained recently as good readers have like this filing cabinet in their head, and that's their schema. And as you read new content, you open up your filing cabinet in your head and you connect to that. You remember reading that in another time, or you saw that in a movie, or you had that experience. Struggling readers often, or English language learners, may not have that schema. So we have to help them build that before they start. This example of the picture there is, to give you some background, is a unit in a sophomore world history, world literature class, where we taught imperialism through the lens of the Igbos in Nigeria and read Things Fall Apart. Well, the students, first off, didn't know Africa, let alone Nigeria, most of them. So we had to do some work building the background knowledge to that particular culture. So what you see there is one image of a variety of images in a gallery walk. And you can do those many different ways, but one way is to put your images around the room in stations with a piece of chart paper beside it and have the students just simply write down, what do you notice in this image? And then what do you wonder about? And that, as you see that little dialogue there in the different color markers, the students were given a marker and they literally just had that, what do you notice? What do you wonder about? Conversation. If you can have them, you can set a timer and have them go from poster to poster. Sometimes I have had, when they get back to their home place where they started, they read everyone's comments and circle some of the best questions or circle some of the best observations and report those out to the class. That's a good way to wrap up a gallery walk. You can also do carousel brainstorming or tabletop conversations, very similar idea, in that before you introduce a topic that might be new to students, ask a big overarching question or a big thought-provoking question to get them thinking and have a discussion in writing before they go to text. For instance, for a political science class that was starting a unit on the presidency, I saw a teacher put the question up, what makes a good leader? And either the carousel brainstorming was as posters were around the room, or the tabletop conversation was just a piece of big white paper or the butcher block paper across a group of desks, and the students would have a discussion with their marker. And the teacher said, I want you to talk with your marker and answer that. And you could have your own idea or you could answer to someone else's. Is all fair in love and war? That was for an introduction to a World War II unit. Is it ever okay to rebel against the government? That was a tabletop conversation I saw a teacher do getting ready to teach the road to the American Revolution. What ideals are worth fighting for? So what you're doing as you have those conversations with students is building something in that schema, in that filing cabinet, that they can connect to as you teach the content in that unit. I would also encourage you to always have a purpose for student reading. Why are they reading? None of us probably read textbooks or read factual, maybe I'm wrong, factual type of reading just for entertainment. We read it to learn. We read it to figure out something. So establish a purpose for your student reading. Are you reading to answer a question? Are you reading to figure out why a country entered the war? Because tomorrow we're going to have a debate about that, and you need to be able to understand some content to have that debate. I would also say, especially as you focus on inquiry, encourage student-generated questions. How do you do that? That's a challenging one sometimes because we all have our standards and we all have a path that we know our class needs to go with our curriculum maps. But how can you incorporate strategies to get students to do some of the questioning themselves? And I'm going to show you two that I really like that are really simple to use. One of those is I see, I think, I wonder. You can also shorten this to I notice, I wonder. And this is nothing magical. This is a word table with 3 columns. So what you would do is you would either put a visual up on your screen or you would show a video clip, something to pique their interest and build some background knowledge. And in this first column, you would have them jot down all their ideas about what they see. Very literal on that. I see trees. I see a man in a uniform. I see a fort, whatever that might be from the image. In the middle column, you do I think, and that's where you jump to inference a little bit. So what do you think this means? Or what do you think this painting's about? Or what do you think this video is trying to tell us? Or this political cartoon is trying to teach us? And then the third column is I wonder. What do you wonder about? And if you give students a few minutes to do that themselves, you could even then have them share with a partner and share their questions. Those questions can guide what you do next in your unit. So sometimes, like I've seen teachers do, it's either I see, I think, I wonder, or just 2 columns, I notice, I wonder, and they write those questions on the board and they leave them up there for the course of the unit. For instance, I just recently saw someone do a Mesopotamia painting, and they had some sort of painting about the achievements of Mesopotamia. That was their standard. So they had a visual that they showed, and as they had students do, I see, I think, I wonder, she wrote down all the questions students wondered about Mesopotamia. And then as she taught that and they did the different texts, they would constantly have a discussion of, did we answer anybody's question today? So the kids feel like, hey, we have some ownership in that. Show you another one of my favorite ones, and if this is new to you, I put the website on there for you. It's called Question Formulation Technique, and it's by Dan Rothstein and Lou Santana from their book, Make Just One Change. And their whole premise is that in school, we teach kids to answer questions. We don't always teach them to generate questions. So they developed this relatively simple template for teaching kids to ask good questions that they call the question formulation technique. And I put the bullets here on the slide for you, but if you are interested, look at their website at writequestion.org, and they have an educator network, and they have videos and examples and PowerPoints that you can use to do this with your students in variety of content areas with a variety of age group of students, so you can see what it looks like. But here's what you do basically, and then I'll kind of show you a couple of pictures that I have used to do this with students. You start this question formulation technique with a question focus, or they call it a Q focus. It's some sort of visual. It could be a painting, it could be a political cartoon, it could be a pamphlet, it could be something students look at and they wonder about. You could use a quote. You could use a short story, as long as it's not too much reading, some little anecdote to start a story. But you show them that cue focus, and you give them 2 or 3 minutes, and they can do it either individually or with a group, to produce as many questions as they can think of with that particular image. You call time, and you have students share their questions with each other, and then categorize them as closed or open-ended. So closed questions would be those knowledge recall type of questions. Open-ended would be the hows, the whys, the higher level thinking kind of questions. You could even have them practice changing closed questions to open-ended and vice versa. And then you let them prioritize their best questions. And I put 3 on this slide. You could choose 1 or 4, it doesn't matter, but they pick what are their best questions from their table, and they have to explain why they chose them. You then would let them share those questions and maybe write those on the board, and that's going to guide their thinking and guide their inquiry for the rest of the unit. So you also can have them then reflect on how did that process work. So if their questions are on the board, then that's why they read the next day, or that's why they watch the video, because they are trying to find out some answers to questions that they generated. Let me show you some examples. This is one I have used in world history, and I've also used this in professional learning experiences with teachers. In whatever group I have used it with, the questions are very similar. So even middle school students and adults, when they look at Diego Rivera's colonial domination mural, you can imagine the kind of things they're going to ask. And you give them just a couple of minutes to brainstorm questions like, who are these people? Why are they dressed differently? Why are there some people in the back of the back right corner that look like they're working? Are there dead people in the top right hand corner? What's the cross, and how come those people are dressed differently? Why are there so many animals in the bottom right? And you just generate lots and lots of questions. Well, as they go through the process of QFT, they will realize they usually pick some of their best questions are, what is this about? What happened? Why are there negative consequences in there? Like you see the laborers in that. And then that will guide what you do in your Age of Exploration unit and help them figure out answers to their questions. This is also one I've used with kids and with teachers as well, and to introduce the immigration unit. A lot of us teach immigration at middle school or high school or even elementary school sometimes. You can imagine the type of questions students will generate. Who are these people? Why are they going? Where are they going? Why are they going? Where did they come from? And what happens when they get there? And honestly, those are the kind of questions that are in almost everybody's immigration standards. So you're letting that student-driven inquiry guide what you do next. Any questions at this point about pre-reading strategies? I'm going to keep talking. You'll type if you have anything you think of. I wanted to also show you the Library of Congress Teacher's Guides and Analysis Tools. If you have not seen those or used those, I like them because they organize the templates into what I think is an inquiry-based way of thinking. For instance, if you look at the little columns, this particular one is analyzing photographs and prints. The columns are observe, reflect, and question. And so as you give this template to students and you have them looking at a photograph or a print, they jot down answers to what do you observe in the image. Reflect is that inference we talked about. What do you think it means? What do you think the artist is trying to say? Question is, what questions do you still wonder about? What do you want to know? And I like the bottom part because then it's like, okay, what's your plan? How could we figure that out? So students can kind of work through a variety of primary sources using this template as well. If you haven't used it before, there are probably, I don't know, 8 to 10 of them, and they have analyzing maps, analyzing political cartoons, analyzing primary documents, and they're all, you can just search Library of Congress Teacher's Guides and Analysis Tools, and they'll give you lots of examples of that. Okay, so what does this look like in active classroom? So I wanted to kind of show how you might use this in active classroom. And so I wanted to show how do you start a unit with a visual in our pre-reading. So I'm going to kind of think out loud and tell you my thought process as we do these screenshots of active classroom. I wanted to do American Revolution, that time period, because I know that's pretty common across the country in different states. So I did my advanced search for political cartoons and U.S. history. This is what came up is the Poor Old England cartoon. And in active classroom, there's the image examiner tool, which makes you able to divide it in quadrants or to make it larger. So we're going to make it larger. So this Poor Old England cartoon, if I were starting with this and using it as my cue focus, I would put it up and have students brainstorm. What do you notice? What do you think it's trying to tell us? What do you wonder about from this cartoon? And you could almost keep that cartoon up in your room through the whole story of the road to the revolution. An active classroom also has activity questions that lead to those literacy skills as well. And I just put some in orange and did some of the highlights on there. What do we think the goals of the cartoonist were? Is the cartoonist favorable to one side or another? Do we think the cartoonist believes conflict is inevitable? So those kind of questions are intentionally making students analyze that visual. And a logical next step is let's read something. Let's figure out, okay, what does that cartoon mean? What's going on with Britain? And why are they trying to keep those colonists under reins? Oh, Marjorie said you had used right question technique. Thank you for sharing that. It's really one of my favorites. Okay, so during reading, these I think are pretty basic, but if you are not using them, I challenge you to do that and think about that and how you end the school year and even as you plan for next year. During reading, chunk your text. If it is a long, complicated text like my Patrick Henry story, chunk it into smaller pieces. If they're not logical paragraph divisions, then make those. Just draw marker lines before you copy in section ones. Have kids read a chunk of text and then stop and talk about it because it makes that more manageable. Think out loud with them. I think sometimes students think that we as teachers know what all the text is about and know the complicated words, and we understand political cartoons because we are the teacher, but all of us know that is not the case. So think out loud with them. Read the first paragraph together before you let them loose with the text, which would have worked great in my Patrick Henry example in hindsight. Tell them what you do when you get to a difficult vocabulary word. Do you go back and reread? Do you look for context clues? Is it a word that sometimes you can just skip and it's not critical to the meaning? Do you look for main ideas? Do you reread a sentence when it's complicated? So do the first paragraph or section together with them. Annotate and model your thinking out loud before you turn them loose. I would also encourage you to get students in the practice of annotating text. You can do that a variety of ways. Give them a purpose. What are they annotating for? Are they looking for main ideas? Are they looking for clues to help us answer our question? Are they looking for, like in my example, are they looking for examples of persuasion that Patrick Henry used? You can have them circle, highlight, write questions in the margins, draw pictures. The example you see there in the picture is a middle school U.S. history teacher who has been having students annotate text all year long. And so at the end of the year now, the students are so used to doing that instead of him modeling his thinking, he has student volunteers come to the active board, and you can tell that student has underlined and has written in the margins and has circled words, and it's just a part of how their classroom runs. I recently heard someone explain this to students as why we need to do it is because we can't see what they're thinking when they read. We can't see their schema or their mental processes. So if we have them annotate, it's showing the tracks of their thinking on paper. And I like that phrase. I thought that was really good. Sometimes too, if you haven't used this before, this worked for me. I would find when I assign students to annotate the main ideas, if they had a highlighter, it would be an explosion of hot pink or an explosion of lime green because they annotated or highlighted everything. Or same thing, they would underline everything. So I would let them choose what were I called VIPs. And every time we did a text, I would pick a number. There's no magical right or wrong to this. I would say today's text, for instance, you get 3 VIPs. So you can only highlight or underline 3 of the most important points. So you give them time to do that, and then the high level thinking in that is have them talk to a partner and explain which they picked for VIPs and why. They have to defend that. So feel free to use that strategy if that works for you. And strategies after reading. These are quick. I know I'm going quickly, so feel free to ask questions if you have, or share ways that you've used any of these. I would say anytime you have students read, do something with it after they read. So I would encourage, as much as you can, to provide opportunities to talk about text. That can be a simple turn and talk to your neighbor or your elbow partner. It could be a more developed type of strategy. One of my favorites is reciprocal reading. And if that is new to you, there are many examples online of how to do that. So you take a text, you chunk it into chunks like we talked about, and then you assign roles for students. So you decide how many roles you want. You might want a reader, you might want a summarizer. One of my favorites is a connector, because that person's going to listen for things that connect to something they've learned already. You can have a vocabulary finder. Usually I would suggest no more than groups of 3 or 4, but you have them read the first chunk of text and they stop and talk about it using their roles. So if I'm the summarizer in the group, my job is to listen and then summarize. If I'm the connector, I'm supposed to listen or read and figure out how this connects to something else we've talked about already. And then you have them read the second chunk and you can have them switch roles. So everybody gets a little piece of that, but they read and stop and talk about it, and read and stop and talk about it. I have also used a modified jigsaw and used expert and home groups. And expert groups were number groups and home groups were letter groups. And I would give each expert group a piece of text. It could be a section out of a textbook or a short excerpt of a primary source. And all the ones, I would number them number off 1 to 5, however many different texts you have. All the ones would get together, I would give them their text and they would work through it together and become experts on it. Then everybody in those expert groups got letters, So A, B, C, D, E. So in an expert group number 1, you would have a 1A, a 1B, a 1C, a 1D. So then you move them to home groups, you regroup, and in those home groups or letter groups, there's an expert who read every different source. So you had them share their source with their groups who didn't read what they read, and then give them some sort of task at the end. It might be a question about what were the multiple perspectives on World War I, and I gave them all different little sources to be experts on. You can also, kind of a simpler way to do that is if you have, say, 2 or 3 different texts that are different perspectives on an issue. You have them copied on different color paper to begin with, and this is just kind of a classroom management trick. So you have 3 different texts possibly being read in the classroom, and then you regroup and say, I want you to get with somebody who has the other color paper, and you share your text and you see if the opinions are the same or different. That's a quick, easy way to manage the movement. Also, I'd always say connect to that purpose for reading. Why are we reading again? Are we reading to answer our essential question for the day? Are we trying to figure out clues to those questions we generated ourselves? We're using the text to do something. A colleague of mine used to always say, don't just say read, just always say read and. And so the students know they're always going to do something with whatever you assign them to read. So let's talk about what does this look like in active classrooms. So I'm going to show you a world history example and a US history example. So one of my favorite series in active classroom is decision making. And if I am a world history teacher on this one, this particular lesson is about ancient history. So it gives students 3 different cultures, and you don't know which those cultures are at the beginning. So one, it doesn't tell you this, but one is Egypt, one is Mesopotamia, and one is in nomadic culture. There are short and long versions of the text, which would help as far as differentiating a little bit. That was one of our questions. So you know your readers and you know the abilities that will give you some flexibility with that. But before I even gave them the text, I would do something to build some background knowledge, and we would brainstorm together what are some traits of a place that would make us want to settle there. Let's zap back in history. What would we want? And they will always almost always say we want water, we want land to farm, or whatever that is. So you start that thinking process before you give them the text. I'm going to flip to the next slide and show you what the text looks like. So in this particular decision-making activity, you have Society A, Society B, and Society C. And you don't know who they are, but you have some pictures, so the kids could use that as a text. But I would just simply start off doing a think aloud and read that first paragraph out loud together, annotating, and I would tell them, let's annotate our text. Either you could print this out if you don't have all students on computer and annotate with a highlighter, or an active classroom, you could use the digital tools. But let's look for clues about, first off, what might make this a good place to live. We're going to circle that, like rich soil. I would make sure we circled that. Crops by the river. Or we're also going to annotate for clues about where this might be. So I've given them a purpose to the reading. I'm going to model that first one together. And then I might put them in groups and have each group have one society. You can figure out your numbers however you want, but you want some reading Society A, some Society B, and some Society C. They might read and annotate, and then I would regroup. So there are little groups created with an A, B, and C together. And here's what they're going to do. They're going to share their society, and they're going to decide which society would be the best place to live, but also give reasons for their choice, which is backing that up with evidence we talked about earlier. So one more example, and we'll wrap this up. So let's say I'm doing a World War II or U.S. history course. World history or U.S. history course, and I'm thinking about my World War II unit. I'm going to intentionally think about how do I not only teach content, but how do I integrate literacy skills? So my content, I know I'm going to teach that the U.S. dropped the bombs at the end of the war. Did they end quicker? And I know this is probably content that'll have multiple perspectives, but my literacy focus all year, we've been working on sources and evidence from texts and multiple perspectives. And I want to be real intentional about including secondary sources and primary sources and some visuals, remembering that I've got to give them lots of opportunities to interact with a variety of these texts. So I go to Active Classroom and I set my search bar for world history in the time period. And I always like starting with a visual first. So I look for a video. There is one on the atomic bomb, and this one's a little longer than some in Active Classroom, but I like that it has that they have to listen for the main idea and details to support it. There also happen to be secondary sources. This one came from Focus on World History, because I know they don't know much about just basically the days and where they were dropped and how many people were killed. Then I also happen to find under this series, there are pro and con perspectives on dropping the atomic bomb. And they're short excerpts, which will work well for a variety of reading abilities. Just a reminder that Active Classroom has the text-to-speech tools that it will read aloud to them, will translate, will show pictures. So if you're a one-on-one type of classroom, make sure you use those tools for your struggling readers. And I can also customize how I want them to highlight. If I want them to know opinions on both sides of this decision to drop the bomb, I go and I choose my atomic bomb reading, and I can customize my highlights. I might choose one color to look for pros, reasons to drop the bomb, and another color for them to highlight for reasons against the bomb, and use that to discuss this decision with multiple examples of text. So that's a quick, easy way to do that in Active Classroom. Or if you're an emerging tech classroom, you can also print those out with highlighters and accomplish the same type of discussions and use the same type of literacy skills. So what questions or comments do you have?
That's a lot of great information, Jana. I
It
am
was
so
very quick.
just kind of waiting now to see if any of our participants have some questions or comments at this point. But lots of great information there, a lot of great strategies for getting students to be the ones who pose the questions and integrate and interact more with the text. Very, very impressive. Anybody have any questions or comments for Jana? Thanks, Melissa. I agree.
Thank
Excellent
you.
ideas. Okay, I'm not sure about that question, Vanessa. What about you, Jana?
Cost of active classroom or cost of, can you elaborate on that just a little bit? And thanks for those kind words.
Oh, great. Cost for active classroom. Vanessa, I will be glad to have a sales rep reach out to you, but I don't know that answer off the top of my head. I'm the professional learning director, and Jana is a contractor, so I'm afraid we're a little ill prepared to answer questions about cost. I should have your email address, and I'll be glad to send it to you. And no, it does not depend on the number of students, though. I do know that much. Once you buy Active Classroom, it does encompass all of your students for all of your classes, no matter, you can buy it by subject or you can buy all the subjects. I do know that much. Any other questions from anyone?
Pam, those look like active classroom questions.
Okay, let's see. Yes, there are district licenses, and I would say that is probably the most common way that it is sold, but we also have a lot of schools or teachers around the country who do buy a teacher license or just a school-based license. So that is certainly doable, but I would say that the most common way is through a district license, especially like if your state is going through a textbook adoption. Active Classroom can be a great choice to replace the traditional textbook. It's very much a comprehensive program. And I see a question up here. Is it portable if you buy it? So yes, Vanessa, if you were to purchase Active Classroom and you were to change school districts, yes, that license would belong to you if you're the one that purchases it. Okay. Guys, I've had some really good questions on here today. I have not had those before. Thank you so much for that.
Well,
Love
Pam, if
getting new questions.
I was going to say, Pam, if I can jump in, I have my email on here. If you have any questions about any of the things I talked about today, probably the active classroom needs to go to Pam, but if I can help you with any of the literacy strategies, please feel free to email me.
Thank you so much, Jana. It has been a pleasure having you on today. I'm so glad you could be with us. We look forward to bringing you back for some more webinars in the near future. We're just delighted that all of our participants were able to be with us today. Thank you. After working in your classrooms and districts all day, we appreciate you joining in and participating with us. We hope that you'll come back and be with us again also. There is a short survey after the webinar closes. And also, I will be sending you links tomorrow for the webinar, and you will also receive a certificate showing your participation in the webinar today. Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Jana, again, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.